Amen. Well, I thought tonight we'd start in Ecclesiastes. This is the first teaching that I've done in 2022. And so I've been thinking a lot. Actually, I started thinking pretty early on in December about how I wanted 2022 to be different from 2021. I've made some resolutions. One of the things I actually read some articles and stuff on making resolutions because I've made some in the past that haven't come much to true. Um, one resolution, for example, that I made this year is I am making a resolution that I'm going to be more aggressive about being a techie. Uh, I see my sister's on this call and she knows that I am definitely not a techie. I can turn my computer on and after that I often get stuck. And so I'm rounding up help and going after being more of a techie this year. Don't know how far I'll get, but that's one of my resolutions. Then something that I think that God has impressed on me, and I'm going to credit the the Bonita Springs, Florida Police Department for this because they are everywhere. It's just like, I don't know how they get so many cop cars on the road, but it just seems like you can hardly drive around Bonita Springs without seeing one, which is actually a good feeling, but it's also caused me to really slow down. I stop at stop signs, I go the speed limit, and at first it was annoying to me because I tended to do rolling stops and go over the speed limit, and I was always in a hurry. And all of it just as I slowed down and that song came back, and I don't even, some of you guys are big song people and you know the group that did Slow Down, You're Moving Too Fast, you gotta make, you guys know that song about slowing down, and that just sung through my head a number of times. And I find that as I slow down, life has become more peaceful. And some of these prophecies, like Lynn, your manifestation today, that the Lord said, I'll lead you into new life. Well, it's not new life from the standpoint that our whole life is going to die off. It's not new life from the standpoint that we get new everlasting life because we already have everlasting life. So what's the new life? It's a new experience of life. It's a new richness of life. It's a new comfort in life. It's a new enjoyment of life. And I really believe that this could be the year for the Lord to do that, to lead us into a new experience of life, a new engagement of life. And for me anyway, I know that's going to involve slowing down, not in the pace with which I am working, but just in my mind, that I'm taking the time to experience the Lord more. That's, I guess, a good way to express it. And then, Greg, in your manifestation, you said our hearts hunger to know you, God. And I thought, okay, that's great. Our hearts hunger to know you. Are we willing to follow our heart? What do we have to change? If we're hungering to know God, which I am, and I believe you are too, if we're hungering to know God, then we've got to be doing things that point us in that direction. And so it was that kind of thinking that as I was praying over the week about tonight's teaching, I think that Ecclesiastes came up because a real central heartbeat of Ecclesiastes is enjoying the process of life. I know so many times in my life I get focused on the end result. And I'm like right now, Bill Schlegel and I are translating. We're in 2 Kings. We're in 2 Kings chapter 12. And sometimes I think, oh, I can't wait to get to the end of 2 Kings, 2 Kings, and then we can start out. And it's like, no, it's really, I'm having a blast just in the scripture deeply every day. So just enjoy that. God's saying, is it really Is it really about being in a hurry to get to the end? And then what? It's really about enjoying the moment. So as we look into Ecclesiastes, and I'm just going to skim through some parts of this. Obviously, I want to cover, like I say, a thesis, which is taking the time to enjoy life and what happened with the sage, who I believe is Solomon. I believe this book was written by Solomon. It's called basically the sage, if you will. The words of the sage is verse 1, son of David, king of Jerusalem, which would fit with Solomon. Verse 12, I, the sage, was king over Jerusalem. Verse 13, and I applied my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all that's done under the heavens. Now, this is a part summary statement here in verse 13, because he's in part he's living in it, in part he's reflecting back because he's already experienced the stuff that's in the book. And so he says, you're searching out by wisdom about everything done under the heavens. That's basically called too much work, not enough time. If you're going to search out everything, too much work, not enough time. And I don't know how much you guys feel about that, but I feel about that quite often, and trying to ratchet that down a bit. And he says, it's a burdensome business that God has given to the sons of men to be busied with. And it's not that God has given it to the sons of men, it's that the sons of men, and I'm going to speak for myself, I often took that upon myself. And it is a burdensome business to be under that pressure. So let's walk through this. So here's Solomon in verse 17, and he starts out, he doesn't start out, but he's continuing, I applied my heart to know wisdom and to know madness, which we call insanity, and foolishness. And I perceived this was herding the wind. In other words, it's pointless. You can't herd the wind. It's absolutely pointless to try to know all this stuff. But what I want to point out here is that as we start Ecclesiastes, Solomon has not yet encountered God. He's very self-centered, very selfish, very self-focused. Notice, I applied my heart, I perceived, and that's where he's going to go. If we go to chapter 2, I said to myself in verse 1, come now, I will test you with pleasure. So Solomon now, from a self-centered perspective, being uber rich, very powerful, is going to be able to do a lot of things that other people can't do. And they're going to end in nowhere. They're going to end in frustration. They're going to end in misery. And so he starts out where a lot of people with money and power start out, pleasure. And in verse 1, I'm going to test you with pleasure to see what is good. But by verse 2, you can only do so much pleasure. It's I recently had to turn in my Subaru and bought another car. And the guy that I bought a car from was older and very experienced. And so there's a lot of paperwork that you have to do. So we spent some time sitting around chatting. Well, he said, I'm back at this. And well, what do you mean? And he said, I love to fish and I retired. He said, I always had this idea that I could retire and then I'd get all the time I wanted to fish. And I said, great, I like to fish too. How'd it go? And he said, I liked it for the first couple of months. And then he said, just going fishing every day, it was boring. It wasn't nearly as much fun as work. So I came back and got my old job back. And now I enjoy my job and enjoy fishing. And I thought, that's exactly the truth. I mean, they're just trying to do whatever you want to do all the time. It's kind of a dead end road. So he tried pleasure in verse 2. He says, how stupid, doesn't accomplish anything. So then, of course, he has to try out alcohol. That's verse 3. And then in verse 4 to verse 8, the word me or myself occurs 8 times in 5 verses, or 4 verses rather, excuse me. Is that 4? Yeah, 5 verses. So it's really an expression of how self-centered Solomon was. Verse 4, I made great works for myself. I built myself houses. I planted vineyards for myself. I made gardens and private gardens for myself. Verse 6, I made pools of water for myself. And then in verse 7, he buys slaves and he gets herds and flocks. Verse 8, he gathered silver and gold for myself. I got male and female singers for myself. And there's even there are some Hebrew texts, and I want to research this a little more deeply, that include the word myself in verse 7 as well. And I'm not sure, I didn't get to do enough research to figure out if I felt like they were the more original texts or not. But it's possible that this could have been very much 8 times in 5 verses. And so what do we see here with Solomon? He's very self-focused. And what's the result of being self-focused? You end up not enjoying life. You end up being frustrated. And that happens to Solomon. He says in verse 10, whatever my eyes desired, I didn't keep from them. Then verse 15, he recognizes. He said, as it happens to the fool, so it happens even to me. Why then was I more wise? Now, we have to understand this in the right context. When he says, verse 15, then I said to myself, as it happens to the fool, and it's talking about death. You know, wise people and fools both die. So he says, so why then was I more wise? We have to understand here that he's still in the worldly wisdom. And worldly wisdom, as we saw from chapter 1, is burdensome. It's hard. It's hard to acquire all that natural knowledge. This is not talking about the spiritual wisdom that you gain from your walk with God. This is Solomon trying to learn everything. And so here he's like, wait a minute. The fool who doesn't bother to learn anything goes and dies. And I, who've worked my tail off learning all this stuff, I die and it's the same. And he says, that's completely pointless. And where does it end up? Verse 17 of chapter 2. So I hated life. And that's why so many people are unhappy, because they're in a what that hamster wheel thing, you know, where you're running, you see something out there, you've got a goal. It's not a bad thing to have a goal. In fact, it's a superb, wonderful, fantastic thing to have a goal. But the goal, you don't enjoy the goal. You've got to enjoy your relationship with God as you're moving toward the goal. Like if, let's say you had a goal here in 2022, I'm going to read the Bible for the first time in my life. I'm going to read the Bible cover to cover. I'm going to get one of those pericopes that tells me what to read on every day. And by golly, in 2022, I'm going to read the Bible. You know, it's not going to help you if you don't enjoy reading it every day. If, you know, a month from now, you're like, hey, I'm on track. Yay for me. You know, and all you're thinking about is the goal of having read the Bible in a year. You're missing the point, because the point is the experience of being in the text, thinking, meditating, discussing, interacting, being pulled into a relationship with God on a daily basis. That's what's exciting. That's the point. And then if you get the whole Bible read in a year, fantastic, wonderful, praise the Lord, what a great year. And if you don't get the whole Bible read in a year because you've stopped to smell some roses somewhere else, or you decided to do some extra deep reading in an area, or you took time out to be with your family for a week or two, or whatever it is that the end of the world? No, because you've enjoyed the process. And Solomon finally wakes up to this, and he goes through a shift, because in verse 23 of chapter 2, he says, you know, this guy that's working, all his days are pain, and his business is frustrating. Yes, even at night, his heart does not rest. And then he says, and this is pointless, and it is. But then verse 24, there's a shift. So we listen. There's nothing better for a person then he should eat and drink and make his soul enjoy good in his labor, not when his labor's finished, but in his labor, in the daily work. We enjoy what we're doing. We enjoy our relationship with God. That's a challenge because it means that, especially for those of us that are able, we need to be thinking about how to adjust life so that our day, the process of what we do in the day, we can figure out ways to enjoy it. And Franklin Smith's mom, Annabelle Smith, who I love very dearly, and she's a mom with 4 kids and a bunch of grandkids and a husband and a house to take care of and all the stuff that housewives have to do. And she used to say, life is so daily. And what does that mean? Life is so daily. Well, there's dishes to wash every day. You got 4 kids and a husband, you're going to be washing dishes every day. There's clothes to wash several times a week. They lived close to the beach, so there's incessantly sand on the floor. So you're vacuuming several times a week. And you've got to learn how to enjoy the process with your family and your kids and the life that God has called you to. And and make this daily life a joy, and figure out how to invite God into your daily life, and how to invite yourself into God and into what you're experiencing with God in your daily life. And it can be a challenge, but that's also part of what fellowship is about. Hebrews chapter 10, let us spur one another on to love and good works. So we get in discussions. If you're bogged down, if you're struggling with something, you call somebody up. That's why I love having on the screen, you see my name and then where I live. And then I see other people, and you see their name and you see where you live, and you find out, is there anybody close to me? Or you see somebody's name and you say, wow, I'd like to get to know them better. I'd like to talk about this stuff with them, because we're a fellowship and we're growing as a fellowship. And then you can private message somebody on the chat function thing and say, hey, here's my cell phone number. I'd like to get to know you better, but we talk to each other about life so we can interact with life better. And so here in verse 24, there's nothing better than a person should eat and drink and make his soul enjoy good in his labor. And that's pretty true. Sometimes your soul is going to go kicking and screaming, I hate doing this. You can't hate doing this. No, I hate doing this. You can't hate doing this. Like Snidely Whiplash. You will pay the rent. And you kind of drag yourself into this relationship of just getting into daily life. And he says, this I saw, that it's from the hand of God. Verse 25, for who can eat or who can have enjoyment apart from him? And that's really true. Look where he was back in verse 17. He had all this wisdom, all this money, the all the things he wanted. And he says, and I hated life. And here he's got the key. Who can eat or have enjoyment apart from him? Verse 26, for to the one who pleases him, God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy. So now if we're sitting there going, wait a minute, I think I please God. Do I feel like I have wisdom and knowledge and joy? And if I say, no, I don't think I do, then I've got a target to work for. Okay, what can I do to gain more joy in my life? Because if I please God, God's wanting to give me joy. So I'd like to grab some of that if I could. And then it says, to the sinner, he gives the business of gathering and collecting, only to the give to the one who pleases God. And so praise the Lord. We end up, especially in the next life, we end up with all the stuff. Then you go over to chapter 3. And like I say, I'm kind of cherry picking some of these verses so we can keep our theme up. So in verse 12, he says, I know that there's nothing better for people than to rejoice and do good as long as they live. So we're just gonna do good things, and we're gonna rejoice in what we have to do. And life is so daily. There's a lot of things we have to do. We have to do it tomorrow. We have to do it the next day. And we learn just to relax into those things and get them accomplished. Verse 13, and also that each one should eat and drink and enjoy the good resulting from all his labor. This is the gift of God. So as you work and enjoy your work with God in the picture, you will accomplish things. And so take the time and enjoy what you've accomplished. You know, we'd say take time to smell the roses or whatever. But as we accomplish certain things, take time to enjoy that. And then he closes verse 13 with, this is the gift of God. And it really is. And then as I've read the Bible over and over, one of the things I become sensitive to is the hope is like popcorn. The hope is so important that it kind of pops up unexpectedly in all these different places. And what I mean by unexpectedly is we're not really talking about the hope, but all of a sudden here and there will just be verses inserted about the hope. And so here we are, we're reading in Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and in verse 16, and moreover, I saw this under the sun, in the place of justice, that wickedness was there. Wow. Yeah, we see that today. And in the place of righteousness, that wickedness was there. For example, in our political system, in the court system, there's wickedness when there is, in places that there shouldn't be wickedness. That's very hurtful. It's very frustrating. It's more than annoying. It's painful. And how do we deal with it? Well, how did Solomon deal with it? In verse 17, I said in my heart, God will judge the righteous person with the wicked person. For there is a time of judgment for every purpose and for every deed. Now, here in verse 17, it's very important that we understand what the text is saying, because this is not saying what Ecclesiastes chapter 3 verses 1 to 8 or something like that said, that there's a time for every purpose under heaven, a time to cry and a time to laugh and that kind of stuff. That this verse is not talking about there's a time for every purpose. The context is judgment, and it's one sentence. God will judge the righteous person and the wicked person, for there is a time. What kind of time? A time of judgment for every purpose and every work, not work in the sense of a time to do certain work, but a time to judge people's work or people's deeds, if you will. In this context, deeds is a much better translation than work because it's less confusing. And so here's the hope. Yeah, if we read the newspapers, watch the news, boy, in places that you'd expect righteousness, there's wickedness. How do we deal with that mentally? We just have to rest in the confidence that there's a day of judgment coming, and God is going to level the playing field and make sure that people get what they deserve, and that includes us. And if we want to deserve rewards, then we don't wander around angry and bitter. Bible is very clear. Put away anger, put away bitterness. Let God deal with the wicked people. Let's us get about God's business of turning others to Christ, bringing others to Christ, helping people to get through life without anxiety. And down to verse 22, back to our thesis. So I saw that there's nothing better than that a man should rejoice in his works. And it doesn't mean rejoice once the work is done. It's figure out how to rejoice in those daily things. Just in your daily work, figure out how do we relax? How do we slow down? How do we bring God into the picture? How do we invite him into the conversation and fellowship with him as we're doing the things that we have to do every day? And it says, for that is his portion. Nothing better than we should rejoice in our work, because that's what we've got in lifetime. And it's going to be filled with something. So we might as well figure out how to bring God into the conversation and enjoy it. Then let's go to Ecclesiastes chapter 4. I want to point out verse 6 in Ecclesiastes chapter 4. Better is a handful of rest than 2 fists full of labor and hurting the wind. And what is that saying? What an interesting one-liner. Better is a handful of rest. It's better to be peaceful. If we're peaceful and restful, we can fellowship with God in that moment. We can be invited into his presence. We can invite him into our lives. It's better to have a little bit with rest and peace than 2 fists full of work, which is pointless. Just, I'm going to focus on this work and I'm going to get this work. That's what Solomon did. He was like, I'm going to do this for myself and that for myself and this other thing for myself. And it never ends up being for yourself. We've got to be other focused and God focused. And it's better to have a handful with rest than 2 fists full of work that's just worthless. So we go to chapter 5. And once again, the hope pops up in chapter 5. So in verse 8, if you see the oppression of the poor, have we seen that? Oh my goodness, yes. And the denial of justice and righteousness in the land. Do we see that? Yes. Do not be amazed at the situation. Now, amazed here is a word that's carrying a lot of meanings. It's not just don't be amazed at the situation. It is that. Don't be amazed at the situation, but also don't be burdened by it. Don't be weighed down by it. Don't be distracted by it. Don't let it take you out of your game. Don't let it make you feel miserable. Are we going to see the oppression of the poor? Absolutely, we're going to see it. Are we going to see the denial of justice? Absolutely, we're going to see it. Now we've got to make up our mind ahead of time that I'm going to let God deal with that. I can pray in it. I can, if I can help, I will. But generally speaking, there's a lot of times there's not much we can do other than pray and then get and refocus on what God has called us to do and get about doing it. And what does the author here say? Don't be amazed at the situation, for one authority watches over another authority, and there are higher authorities over them. And guess who the highest authority is? God. And there is going to be a day of reckoning. So we can relax in God, knowing God is going to take care of this stuff. So let's go to Ecclesiastes Chapter 6. And Ecclesiastes 6 has another one of those great verses that's, I'm sorry, first chapter 5. We're still in chapter 5. I want to go to 18. Chapter 5, verse 18. Here's what I've seen to be good. It is appropriate for one to eat and to drink and to see good in all his labor in which he labors under the sun, all the days of his life that God has given him, for that's his portion. So what's your portion? You're going to labor in the days that God has given you. So it's appropriate if during those days of labor, we can enjoy them. We can eat and drink and see good in the labor, the work that we're doing. Verse 19, every man also to whom God has given wealth and riches and has given him the power to enjoy them and to accept his portion and to take pleasure in his labor, this is the gift of God. Verse 20, for he does not brood much over the days of his life, because God keeps him occupied with the joy of his heart. If you enjoy what you're doing, if you've invited God into your life, if you're in that conversation with God on a daily basis, if you've slowed down where you're enjoying that time of your life and your time with God, then you're not keeping this giant diary record of all the things that are going on in life. You're enjoying life and you're taking one day at a time. And that's what God says to do. And then in chapter 6, a powerful one-liner, verse 9, better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of the desire. A lot of people spend a lot of time daydreaming about what they would do if they had money and what would happen if this, and they'd like this to be different, and they'd like this to be better, and they live in really it's a imaginary world of their mind, but it doesn't accomplish much. The sight of the eyes is what's in front of you. what's the reality that you're looking at, and what can you do in that reality to bless God, bless yourself, bless other people. Better is the sight of the eyes and what you've got right in front of you that you can do than just letting your mind wander all over about things that you don't have and probably will never attain. Let's go to chapter 7. Chapter 7, a little bit of a shift to talk about, again, thinking about God and the fact that there is going to be a future, there is going to be a hope. So verse 2 says, it's better to go to the house of mourning than to the house of feasting, for that's the end of all humankind, and the living should take this to heart. Now, when it says better to go to the house of mourning, it doesn't mean live there. It doesn't mean be a sourpuss or a sad sack. It just says, visit the house of mourning. Make sure you're thinking about the end in mind, and that many times can give you the desire to make the right decisions. I think it was Rick Howard in his book on the judgment seat of Christ that said that, many times he was tempted to sin, but he just had to keep in mind the consequence of that. And that would give him the energy and strength to do what was right. And the same thing is true for us. If we understand that there's going to be a day of our death and then judgment day, a lot of times that will give us the energy to stay on the right track. Just something to keep in mind. In chapter 8, once again, the hope pops up. Verse 12. Verse 12, though a sinner does evil 100 times and lives long. And when a sinner does that, you got people around you that just sin and sin and sin and sin, and they never seem to die, and they're always around causing trouble. And, it's like, oh, God, when is there going to be your justice? Well, though a sinner does evil 100 times and lives long, yet surely I know that it will be better for those who fear God, who are reverent before him. Verse 13, but it will not be well with the wicked person, nor will he lengthen his days like a shadow, because he does not fear God. So you want to live forever, you take Christ as Lord. In the Old Testament, you obeyed the law from the heart, that kind of thing. And then you would have long days, i.e. everlasting life. And the person who is the wicked sinner, they won't lengthen their days. They've got this life and not much after it. And then verse 14, there's a pointless thing that's done on the earth, that there are righteous people to whom it happens according to the work of the wicked. Again, there are wicked people to whom it happens according to the work of the righteous. I said that this is pointless. Verse 15, so I recommended the enjoyment of life. In other words, we can't control what happens to us. And sometimes things that happen to us, theoretically, they should be happening to evil people, but they happen to us. And then we see sometimes evil people have things happen to them that should be happening to wonderful people. And what does God say to do about that? Notice he doesn't say you can correct the situation. He just says, again, take a look at your life and see what you can do to engage it and enjoy it. So he says, I recommend the enjoyment of life because a man has no better thing under the sun than to eat and to drink and to be merry, and that will accompany him in his labor all the days of his life that God has given him under the sun. So we slow down and we enjoy life. Ecclesiastes Chapter 9, verse 7, continuing on the theme. And again, notice how many times this theme has been consistent through Ecclesiastes. I mean, this is a huge lesson in Ecclesiastes. Slow down, enjoy your life, enjoy what you're doing, invite God into your life and into your daily tasks, and invite yourself into God's conversation. And God, what do you want me doing? In verse 7 of Ecclesiastes 9, go and eat your bread with pleasure and drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has already accepted your works. Now, that can throw you off. wait a minute, how can he already have accepted my works? Because he said in his word that he accepts good works. So if you're doing good works, God has already accepted them. You don't have to do good works and then go to God and say, do you like these? Because he's going to say, I already said I like those. I've already accepted that kind of work. So we get about doing the things that God has already said he accepts. And that's a powerful truth, that God accepts those things. So he says in verse 8, let your garment be always white. Don't just do righteous things. Do not let oil be lacking from your head. Verse 9, enjoy life with the wife whom you've loved all the days of your pointless life that he's given you under the sun, all the days of your pointlessness, meaning that if you're trying to do something that's going to last, it's not going to work. If you want something to last, you've got to obey God and let him reward you at the judgment. But natural stuff, it just isn't going to last. And so we just work and enjoy that. Then Ecclesiastes Chapter 10 has an interesting verse. It doesn't have really anything to do with enjoying this life, but it's just such an important verse, I think, if we are. It really actually does have something to do with enjoying life, but kind of in a backhanded manner. Because sometimes life can be so unfair, and the justice system falling apart and the political system falling apart, that we can develop a negative attitude instead of pushing those things off to God, letting God handle his stuff and us handling our life. And we can get a negative attitude. And if we get a negative attitude, then obviously we talk about it. And so verse 20 says, do not curse the king. No, not in your thoughts. Do not curse the rich in your bedroom, for a bird of the air may carry your voice, and that which has wings may tell the matter. And it's not talking about demons here. I mean, there may be some far off reference, but that's not really what it's about. What it's about is you're upset about something, mad about something, trying to deal with something, and you spout off to some people that you say, this is never going to go anywhere. They're tight-lipped. They're not going to tell anybody what I said. And the next thing I mean, if you're like me in my life, the next thing here it comes from some third party, and you're like, what? People just talk about people. And the way to avoid that kind of thing is to do exactly what this says. Don't curse the king, don't curse the rich in your bedroom. Just talk nice about people, and that'll go much better for you. Back to our theme in chapter 11, verse 8. Indeed, if a man lives many years, let him rejoice in them all. And that's, again, our thesis. You've got this life. Life is very daily. The tasks we do over and over again. We learn to rejoice in that life, and we enjoyed it. We learn to invite God into that conversation, and then let him remember the days of darkness, for they will be many. Verse 9, rejoice, O young man, in your youth, and let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. And that's really true. There's youth and enthusiasm. Genevieve and I, there's kids in our life, and there's grandkids in their life, and they're so enthusiastic and so much fun to be around. And when you have that youthful energy, if you can dedicate some of that to God, it's really a powerful truth. And then again, the hope kind of comes up in judgment. Walk in the ways of your heart and in the sight of your eyes, it says in verse 9, but know that for all these things, God will bring you into judgment. So this is the second time God's mentioned the coming judgment. 3:17, this is 11:9. It'll come up again in 12:14, chapter 12, verse 14. God's going to bring you into judgment. Verse 10, therefore remove frustration from your heart. And again, how are you going to do that? By inviting God into your life and figuring out how to take that daily life and enjoying it and being blessed in it. Remove frustration from your heart, put away evil from your flesh, for youth and the dawn of life are pointless, and then it goes into chapter 12. And the closing verse in chapter 12, we'll read the closing to verse 13. This is the end of the matter. All has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole purpose of humankind. For God will bring everything we do into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it's good or whether it's evil. So we want to rejoice. We want to enjoy life. We want to do what's good. And living like that, we can look forward to a wonderful future with God, everlasting life and rich rewards. But learning to disengage, if you will, from the pain of life and engaging God in the daily activity of life and rejoicing in that and slowing down and reflecting that joy of the Lord, which is our strength, so that others can see it and others can be touched by our life. That's a huge lesson in Ecclesiastes. So I thought for me, and I'm sure maybe for many of you, that's a great lesson to start 2022 off with, so that we begin the year with the right attitude about the work that we're going to get done and have to do during this year. So with that, thank you all for being with me. It was really fun to do the background work for this teaching, and the floor is wide open for wherever we want to go.